Hey, history friends, let's chat about British tanks in World War II. They're kind of unique when we talk about tanks from that time. Some people really stand up for them, but they don't get as much attention as tanks from other big countries in the war. The thing about British tanks is that they were pretty good, but they had some limits because of the way they were designed. Their design was more about how they planned to use them in battle, which was different from countries like Germany, the US, or the Soviet Union. Those countries focused more on what they could make with their factories or their big war plans. Now let's talk about who came up with tanks in the first place. This can be a bit of a hot topic. Some say the French because they made a tank that looked like the ones we think of today. But the British were the first to actually use a tank in battle. They were the first to shoot at someone with a tank. So in my book, that makes them the pioneers of the tank. All right, let's talk about something really interesting that happened during World War I. You know, wars are not just about fighting, they're also about coming up with new ideas and gadgets. During this war, the British had a cool invention: tanks. These are like huge armored vehicles that move on tracks, kind of like a bulldozer, but designed for battle. Now, the British had a plan for using these tanks in a special way. They thought, hey, what if we use two different types of tanks together? So they came up with this idea: have two kinds of tanks working side by side. The first type was called infantry tanks. These were big, heavy, and a bit slow. Their job was to smash through the enemy's defenses, like breaking down a tough wall. The second type was cruiser tanks. These were lighter and faster, kind of like race cars compared to trucks. Once the infantry tanks broke through, these cruiser tanks would zoom through the gap and race around, causing trouble for the enemy, like a fox in a chicken coop. They planned to try this out in a big way in 1919. But guess what? The war ended in 1918, so they never got to use their plan in a huge battle. But the British didn't forget this idea. In the 1920s, they kept working on it and building tanks based on this plan. They really believed in it. Now, some people today think these British tanks weren't the best, but it's important to remember, ideas like this were pretty new back then. People were just figuring out the best ways to use tanks in wars. It's like when you try something new for the first time. You might not get it perfect, but you learn and get better. That's what the British were doing with their tanks. Okay, let's dive into how the British kept improving their tanks during World War II, which is pretty cool to learn about. Imagine trying to build the best toy car, but having to change and try new things until you find the perfect one. That's kind of what the British did with their tanks. First, there was this tank called the Vickers 6-ton. The British Army didn't use it much, but it was sent to other countries and inspired lots of other tank designs. It's like sharing a recipe that everyone else loves and adds their own twist to. When most people think of British tanks in World War II, especially in the deserts of North Africa, they picture two main types: the Matilda and the Churchill tanks. These tanks were like the superheroes of their time. The Matilda, especially the Matilda II, was super strong. It had tough armor, like a knight's shield, and a great layout for the crew inside, making it comfy and safe for them. It also had a powerful gun called the 2-pounder, which was really good at taking out enemy tanks in the early part of the war. In 1940, during a battle in France, some Matilda tanks scared the pants off the German troops led by a general named Rommel. The Germans couldn't figure out how to destroy these tanks, and it caused a huge panic. The Matilda tanks were also stars in the North African desert, earning the nickname Queen of the Desert. They were so versatile that they were used in Europe by the Soviets, and even in Southeast Asia. Talk about world travelers. The Churchill tank was another British star. It stayed in use throughout the whole war. This tank was like the tough guy on the block, known for its super strong armor. It could also get a bigger gun thanks to its large turret, like upgrading a slingshot to a cannon. People say it was one of the tanks that could take the most hits and keep on going. Pretty impressive, right? The cruiser tanks, especially the ones called Crusaders, were pretty neat, but they had a few issues. Imagine having a really fast bike that's super fun to ride, but sometimes it gets a flat tire. That's kind of what happened with these tanks. They were known for breaking down a bit more than others, but when they were working, they were really cool. The crews who drove them liked them a lot because they could go super fast, especially the newer versions. Now, these tanks weren't perfect. The big, heavy infantry tanks were slow, kind of like a big, lumbering elephant. But that was on purpose because they needed to be strong and tough to break through enemy lines. On the other hand, the cruiser tanks were more like cheetahs, fast but not very tough. They had thinner armor, which means they weren't as good at taking hits from enemy weapons. When it came to their guns and stuff, the British did a pretty good job. They tried to make the tanks as good as they could with the weapons they had at the time, and they kept trying to make them better whenever they could, like upgrading parts on a bike or a car to make it faster or stronger. So, in a nutshell, the cruiser tanks were kind of a mixed bag. They were fast and liked by their crews, but had some problems like breaking down and not being super tough. But like with anything new, it takes time to get things just right, and that's what the British were trying to do with their tanks. The British had a certain way of thinking about how to use their tanks. They knew tanks needed support from other parts of the army, like soldiers and airplanes, to do well. This is called combined arms warfare. It's like making sure all pieces of a puzzle fit together. In World War I, a British general named Haig understood this pretty well. But by the time World War II rolled around, especially in the early battles in North Africa, it seemed like they forgot some of these lessons. In these battles, British tanks often went into fights without enough support. Imagine going into a dodgeball game all by yourself against a whole team. That's kind of what happened to these tanks. The German soldiers had strong anti-tank guns, like the famous 88S, which could easily destroy the heavy British tanks. And their other weapons and tanks could take out the faster cruiser tanks. So, the British tanks were at a big disadvantage. Another big issue was how the British made their tanks. Unlike countries like the United States and the Soviet Union, which tried to make parts of their war machines similar to each other, the British tanks were all very different. They had different engines, different ways of moving, and different types of armor. This made it hard to make a lot of them quickly because each tank was like building a completely new thing from scratch. It's like if every time you wanted to bake cookies, you had to use a totally different recipe and kitchen tools. This was strange because the British Royal Air Force, RAF, did the opposite and was pretty good at standardizing things. The British were having a hard time with their tanks, and things were looking a bit grim. Then the United States entered the war and started sharing their tanks with the British. Some people might say this sounds a bit too much like bragging, and sure, the British might have their own view on this. It's true there were other important changes like new leaders and better battle plans, but when it comes to tanks, the American help was a big deal. The Americans had this tank called the M3 Lee. It wasn't perfect, think of it like a quick fix or a temporary solution, but it was super helpful for the British at that time. Then there's the famous Sherman tank. The story goes that the first bunch of these tanks were practically taken from American soldiers who were still training with them and sent straight to the British. It was like, hey, you've got a cool new toy, but we need it right now for something super important. Now, I know this might make some people raise their eyebrows, and it's okay to have different opinions about it. But looking at what happened, it seems pretty clear that the American tanks were a big help, especially when the British really needed them. All right, let's dive into how the British were doing with their tanks during World War II, especially when they started using American tanks too. It's kind of like when you borrow a friend's toy, but also keep working on making your own toys better. Even though the British used a lot of American tanks, they didn't just stop making their own. They kept trying new things and even made some changes to the American tanks to suit their needs better. Think of it like customizing a bike to make it more comfortable for you. One cool thing they did was with the American M3 Lee tank. They turned it into something called the Grant. This change was like rearranging the seats in a car to give everyone more room. They removed the spot for the radio operator, which made the tank more comfortable for the crew. Then there's the famous Sherman tank. The British took it and added a big gun called the 17-pounder, creating a variant known as the Firefly. This tank became pretty famous, but it wasn't perfect. The big gun was almost too big for the tank's turret, making it a tight squeeze inside. Imagine trying to fit a large sofa in a small room. It's doable, but not very comfy. The Firefly was actually the second out of 3 attempts the British made to put this big 17-pounder gun on a tank. The first try was with something called the Archer, which was a bit of an oddball. The British kept making their own tanks during World War II and were also using American tanks. They used the American Sherman as a cruiser tank, kind of like a fast attack vehicle, and the Stuart tanks for scouting, like spies checking things out. They came up with a new British tank called the Cromwell. It's a favorite for many, but had some issues. It was designed in 1942, but didn't see battle until 1944. By that time, it was a bit behind compared to other tanks and had some mechanical problems at first. But it was super fast and worked well for scouting. Near the end of the war, the British started thinking about a universal tank, something like what the Americans had with their Sherman and the Soviets with their T-34. They were a bit late to the idea, but they did a great job. The first big success was the Comet tank. It finally fit the big 17-pounder gun comfortably. This tank showed up at the end of the war and was a step in the right direction for the British. They finished the war with the Centurion, a really well-made tank that became the first real main battle tank. It missed World War II but was used in Korea and many other conflicts later. It lasted a really long time in service, showing how good a design it was. Talking about British tanks in World War II, they weren't really bad, just not what was expected for that war. It shows that sometimes plans don't match reality. It's like studying for a test and then getting different questions. It's important to be ready for surprises and not just focus on one thing. What do you think? Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us keep bringing you more great content. Thanks for being part of our community.